Here we are, back again, back together. A Push Nation. We're talking about the 20s still. This is a section on promises postponed. We're looking at groups that didn't necessarily get the attention that they had desired during the 20s. And then we'll talk about the 20s politics and national politics, mostly with the Republican presidents and some of the issues that they dealt with. All right, so promises postponed. Here we have a picture of women's suffrage, right? You get the 19th Amendment, the right to vote. We said before, women, mostly the married women especially, voted the same way as their husbands, right, to not cause divide within the household. So you don't get an immediate change. You don't get an immediate platform within politics. Okay? So you have this feminist movement that had started much before this, that led towards the right to vote, but now they've got it. And so something changes within this feminist movement starting in the 1920s and kind of becomes at its height in the 1960s and 1970s and then alters and changes again. But here we're looking at the 20s, right? And the new feminist movement is looking for equal rights. Okay, so what women and men get to do should be the exact same. Okay. But most women still don't want that. Most women in the 20s are still about the traditional ways of life and enjoying then the protective rights that existed for women. You're like, there's not anything that protects women. Well, look it up. There's a bunch of protective rights, things that women get that men don't. Not saying it's a bad thing, not saying it's a good thing, it just exists. Check it out on your own. So the National Women's Party forms here, and they want the Equal Rights Amendment or the Equal Rights Act. They don't get it. It doesn't exist. But the big fight for it will be in the 70s. But it starts here in the 20s, okay, with this National Women's Party movement. Again, looking for power within politics to try to change their environment, the laws that would be for women. You also have the League of Women Voters, right, that serve on juries and equal pay laws. Okay, so these are things that they start talking about in the 20s that then start to take place in the 1960s and 70s. The Shepard-Towner Act was a welfare program that provided federal funds for infant and maternity care. Okay, so this would be something that would be not an equal right, but a protective right. Okay, women have kids, therefore, this is going to provide them something that would allow them to be able to continue working on their own and have some sort of federal funds for caring for their kids. The next group that is promises postponed belongs to the Mexican immigrants. This is where your documents, you should read and analyze the documents about Mexican immigrants during the 1920s. It doubles from the previous decade. Okay? This is mostly coming into California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Okay, so the Mexican Revolution that happens before this leads towards a bunch of people fleeing Mexico and coming into the United States. Segregation existed. They did a bunch of unskilled, mostly agricultural jobs, and they dealt with really poor conditions and poor health. Read those documents. It'll tell you more about Mexican immigration. We're going to focus on here is the Great Migration. So the movement of African Americans out of the South and into the North cities and Midwest cities, and some out farther west. In those cities, it caused a bunch of riots that were race-motivated riots. It also caused segregation, even though it wasn't specifically legal segregation like there was the Jim Crow laws in the South. There was segregation all across the country. And housing segregation, you didn't have the drinking fountains and the restaurants and things in the North and stuff, but it was the de facto segregation that didn't allow the mixing of whites and blacks from the same public places or within cities, within housing and where they lived. So something that comes about from this in New York is Harlem, and Harlem became an exclusively black residential area. Okay, so where blacks lived, not a lot of whites, very small percentage of whites living in Harlem. A lot of them come from the Caribbean, from Jamaica and the Bahamas, different places during this time, in Puerto Rico, and this will be a place in which they can be able to express themselves in this era out of the South and in a different environment, and a lot of changes will come about from this. They do suffer from overcrowding and high rent. It does develop into business class. There's a larger middle class of African Americans, small business owners that will take a step up in the social ladder. I'm going to show you a video, or I'll put a link in the video because they won't let me do it on YouTube, but I'll put this in the class notes connection on the Google Classroom. So check this video out about Great Migration. But the Harlem Renaissance, which is on your quiz and on your test, you should know that this is what the definition of it: the flowering of African American literature, art, and music in the 1920s in New York City. Because of the exclusivity, I think I said that right, probably not, exclusivity of African Americans in one place out of the South led to all of these new writings, these new philosophies, these new beliefs, a different style of art, and this jazz music that was all about the 1920s and crossing all kinds of racial lines. But it develops around Harlem, New York City. The Second Great Awakening caused this rise in Christianity throughout those black communities in the South, and it will continue in this movement up into Harlem and other places that were cities that had some sort of resemblance to this Harlem Renaissance. Specific writers that you should recognize or know: you might have read something, you should have, in English about from Langston Hughes. You got Claude McKay, Zola Hurston, Marcus Garvey, who we'll get into in a second, and A. Philip Randolph. These are all famous writers. Musicians: Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong. We talked about Armstrong before, and we think we'll talk about him again. All right, so what does this do? It creates an identity in society that is forming into something specific about black culture. Yet the status of blacks is still to be questioned, right? Equality is not something that is going to happen right away. So think back to our previous era, and the Du Bois is still around, but the differences between Washington and Du Bois and their philosophy towards equality, that stuff still influencing the black communities across the country. So here's a different philosopher or writer of the time. His name is Marcus Garvey. Garvey comes from Jamaica man. These notes might be Jamaican you crazy, but anyways, Garvey uses this idea of black nationalism and black pride to an extent that is segregationist or is separate from this assimilation into American culture or American society in some way. And he leads this movement of going back to Africa. So if you can remember the American Colonization Society that started this kind of idea back in the early 1800s that said we can free the slaves and we can send them back to Africa. Garvey believes that that's the only way. That's what should happen. So, Du Bois disagrees, but endorses this Black Pride movement. And all of these people that we're going to look at that are the writers and the musicians and the artists, it's something to celebrate. It's something that they believe they've arrived and they've accomplished on a larger scale than any previous generation of black communities. And it will lead to a lot of changes. So let's get into some of these people and how they have an impact on society. So here's some black writers that we talked about. Harlem Renaissance was primarily a literary movement led by well-educated blacks with a new sense of pride in the African American experience. Claude McKay's poems express the pain of life in the ghetto. Zola Hurston, she wrote novels as a female too, so you get black and female. You can connect back maybe to Sojourner Truth and a previous time and what impact she had, or Harriet Tubman and what Zola Hurston is able to do. She wrote about lives of poor, unschooled Southern blacks, focused on the culture of people, their folkways, and their values, right? Establishing something that is specifically about black communities. And then you got Duke Ellington, who's a famous jazz artist. Now, all these writers and all these musicians that we're going to talk about have some sort of crossover effect between the black community and the white communities and any other minority communities that you can tie into the United States. But those are the two big ones at the time in the early 20s. So we're going to talk about this Cotton Club in which Ellington would have often played here and see its impact beyond than the black community. Bessie Smith, another singer, it says she achieved enormous popularity by 1927, became the highest paid black artist in the world. Langston Hughes, writer, you should remember him for your quiz. A lot of poems that described working class blacks. Here's one. This is Merry-Go-Round by Langston Hughes. Where's the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? Because I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored, can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus, we're put in the back, but there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's the horse for a kid that's black? Okay, so you can discuss that amongst yourselves and see what he's trying to say about all of those other things are linear, right? The train, and the bus, but this merry-go-round's circular, and where does the black kid sit? All right, here's the Cotton Club. So the Cotton Club is this famous jazz nightclub in New York City, and it was only for whites. Whites could come as patrons, but all of the staff and the entertainers were black. So Whites Only Club became extremely popular. A lot of gangsters and celebrities like to hang out at the Cotton Club in New York City. But all the entertainers were black. So what does this say? It says everything about this era. Segregation. Whites being entertained by blacks. It says jazz. That's the time period. That's the music that defines these people and what they're interested in. It says we're going to drink and we're going to party and we're going to have fun and we're going to resist this prohibition era. And the other thing that it does that's connected to the Harlem Renaissance then is gives this platform for musicians, black musicians, to rise in popularity all across the country and all across the world. You have white people that are entertained by black people in an era in which we see the rise of the KKK and the resistance to these changes, this mixture of society and all the race riots. Like it's a pretty fascinating little enclave within this New York area that is known as the Cotton Club. All right, let's talk about politics. 20s politics. First president here of the 20s is Warren G. Harding. He's not going to make it through his first, he doesn't get a chance at a second one, but he doesn't make it through his term as president. But here's some things that people said about him. This is his background. So he was a senator and didn't show up a lot of the times. And then here's the Republican candidates that were more likely to become president out of the progressive era. These guys were noted from California. And, Johnson was from California, and Lafayette was from somewhere in the Midwest, I think Minnesota or somewhere around there. Hughes, who ran for president, lost, and Herbert Hoover was the hero of the World War I with all the rationing and stuff. And so these are your possible candidates, but none of them win. They don't get the nomination. The nomination goes to Warren G. Harding. Here's some things that were said about him. If you want to read these, you can. So here's what his own mother said about him. I was always glad that Warren wasn't a girl. He just couldn't say no. His wife said, I can see but one word written above his head if they make him president, and that word is tragedy. That's rough, right? Like your own wife calling you a loser. And then himself, Warren G. Harding, I feel like a man who goes in on a pair of eights and comes out with aces full. Luck, right? he's a poker player, so we'll get into that in a second too. Here's what he runs on: a return to normalcy, right? You have this progressive era with all these rapid changes, and then you got World War I, massive society changes to the United States and to the world. So your normalcy candidate becomes Warren G. Harding, and he wins on that. Okay. What does it do? Renews isolationism. It says the United States is not going to get involved. George Washington would be proud, right? The Monroe Doctrine is back into effect, exiting out of World War I. This resurgence of nativism, right? Those that are like-minded within the United States and expect assimilation in one culture, that's the movement. That's what they want. Political conservatism, back to Republican ideas, laissez-faire policies, those kinds of things. Progressive ideals fade with the war. The new threat to normalcy then becomes communism, right? This radical belief that because of the Russian Revolution, it might happen in the United States. And so your safe, conservative candidate is then Warren G. Harding. Here's a political cartoon about the Reds. You might see this again somewhere on your test, possibly. But you can see the guy coming through is bringing a torch that has anarchy on it and a knife that says Bolshevism, and labeled his hat there, the Reds. So sneaking into the United States, right, with intents to destroy. Here's Harding's win. The South holds Democrat, and the rest of the country votes Republican. I know usually it's the other colors, sorry, but that's all I can find. So Harding presidency, great economy. Then you have a bunch of scandals. We'll get into those. We need to know what his Ohio gang and poker cabinet are. And this Teapot Dome scandal that comes about from it, where they sold off some federal lands to private oil companies. And these corrupt politicians were making money off of their dealings with private companies. We're going to skip over these people. Here's some things that happened. Cut taxes, 50% drop in unemployment. A lot of good things happening economically for Harding in his 3 years. Advocated for civil rights for African Americans. Ended national railroad strike. 8-hour workdays, subsidies to farmers, treaties with Germany and Austria. Like, these are the good things that Harding brought with him in his administration. Lower the national debt. Then, the Harding scandals is what we need to know. A little too fast. But the Harding scandals involve people that worked under Harding's administration. Not Harding himself, specifically. None of this stuff is tied directly to him. But the people that he put in charge of positions in the government, those are the guys that get into trouble. The people that he relies on the most are known as the Poker Cabinet or the Ohio Gang. All these guys were his buddies. They came from Ohio. That's where most of the, that's where he was senator, that's where his political career was, and so these people were attached to him some way. They came with him. They often played poker in the White House, and so that's how they got the nickname the Poker Cabinet. If you remember, Jackson's nickname to his cabinet was the Kitchen Cabinet, right? Those close advisors to him, only ones that he trusted. So these are the people that are involved with Harding. Okay, so you should have some scandals here. The Justice Department scandal involving Attorney General Doherty. They failed to pursue prosecutions of criminal activity, allowing people to get away with criminal activity. Then you have the Veterans Bureau scandal, which Charles Forbes, the director here of the Veterans Bureau, sold surplus supplies, extra stuff, right, at a fraction of the cost and pocketed the difference. You get a bunch of medical equipment, and you're going to sell it for really cheap, and then just take the money off the top. Then the prison scandal. This was his brother-in-law, and he became the superintendent of federal prisons, and he was charged with protecting drug peddling in the Atlanta penitentiaries, right? So drug deals that are happening amongst the prisoners in Atlanta. The big one, though, that you need to remember for your test and your quiz is the Teapot Dome scandal. Yes, the Elk Hills is in there too, but just remember it as the Teapot Dome scandal. That's the teapot whistling for you to remember the Teapot Dome scandal. That was, I know, a pretty terrible whistle, but anyways. There we go. Much better. So what do? They secretly lease these lands existing in Wyoming to private companies in exchange for cash. The politicians that are involved then are getting rich off of these leasing of federal lands, right? Which they're not supposed to do. It's an abuse of power. So during this, then, as these are uncovered and starts to come out in the newspapers, the president's wife suspects him of having an affair. He's $180,000 in debt, and there's a bunch of criticism in the newspapers about him. So he suspects his friends of wrongdoing, but he's not sure. Like, those are his buddies. Like, those are his trusted people. So some of them that were involved in some of these scandals start to succumb to the pressure, right? One of them commits suicide, Jesse Smith. Another one resigns under Senate investigation. So President Harding decides he's going to figure out what is happening, and he's going to go on vacation. He takes on a trip to Alaska with his wife and a couple of non-cronies, not his specific buddies. So none of the poker cabinet is there. It's his wife, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover again, and Secretary of the Interior Hubert Work. The president talks to these guys to find out, like, hey, like, what's going on? And then he gets sick, and he goes to the doctor. Doctor basically says, you got food poisoning. Another doctor he goes and sees says, you might have coronary thrombosis, which is an enlarged heart. His heart was too big, apparently. And eventually he developed pneumonia, and he got a blood clot and died of a stroke. However, Mrs. Harding denied an autopsy to be taken to prove the real cause of death. Dun, dun, dun. Maybe she did it because he was having an affair. All right. Now, what do you need to know about this stuff? The outcome of the scandals. Doherty escapes jail. Fifth Amendment doesn't say anything at trial. Gets 2 hung juries. He's off. The Veterans Bureau Director, Charles Forbes, convicted, jailed for 2 years. Secretary of the Interior, the big one, Teapot Dome scandal. Albert Fall, convicted and jailed for 1 year and fined $100,000. Right? Not a big time for the crime that was involved with the Teapot Dome scandal. The other two not guilty, and Secretary of the Navy resigned. This guy then comes in to clean it all up. Calvin Coolidge replaces, he was the vice president, so he replaces Harding and then is elected to 1 term. And these are some of the political cartoons. We're just going to skip over them, but you can see all the baggage there. The Teapot Dome scandal, and the Republican Party tied to the Teapot Dome scandal, and the donkey laughing in the background at the Democrat Party. There's Coolidge cleaning off all of the dirt that existed on the Republican Party. All right, then you get some foreign policy stuff that we need to know. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. No, it's not a cereal. It's a pact that involves other nations trying to avoid war. So they don't believe in war. All of these countries that exist within this Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed by 62 countries. Okay? And it didn't really have something that could enforce this. It was just kind of this handshake agreement amongst these nations that war wasn't an option. Eventually, after World War II, this becomes kind of the basis with the League of Nations to become the United Nations. All right, then you have the Dawes Plan, 1924. Charles Dawes, he comes up with this idea to fix the international problems between Germany and England and France and the United States, and this repayment of the Treaty of Versailles with the reparations that are going back to those places from Germany. So it reduces Germany's debt. It says, all right, we know that you can't handle this. We're going to spread it out over a longer period of time. Okay, so it allows them to be able to have some flexibility within their economy. It arranges for bankers to loan money to Germany, allowing them to rebuild. Now, you might know who comes to power within this time period after this, which is Adolf Hitler, which will lead towards World War II. But anyways, the Dawes Plan, what does it do? It helps stabilize Germany's currency, allows for gradual repayment of those reparations, and unpaid debts then cause tension amongst all of these countries involved. So commerce and foreign policy. The United States becomes this creditor during World War I, right, to all these nations. So the capital investment to be spent on friendly nations, not enemies. Okay, so that's driving their foreign policy. Those that are like the United States, they help. Those that are not, nope, not going to help them. So what do you get from this? Maximum freedom for private enterprise. Increases power and profits for overseas investors. It says, look, this is the United States. This is a powerful economy. This is where your money should be. And so it increases this private business of the 20s that helps the economy thrive until 1929, leading towards the Great Depression. We'll get into that into another video. But what does it do? It exploits natural resources of foreign countries. Okay? So it takes what is the resources of those other places, brings them into the United States in a favorable way to allow the United States economic industries to rise. They favored autocratic governments that could protect U.S. investments. Okay, so wherever the United States then puts its investments across the country, they're looking at places that they could make deals with, that it would be safe. Those investments would be protected. What does Coolidge leave as a legacy? Similar things that Harding does. Lowers the income tax, reduces federal spending, subsidies to farmers, spoke in favor of civil rights for blacks and Catholics. And that is it. That is the 1920s. Try to go fast. Maybe use the pause button. But I'm sorry there wasn't any memes or too many jokes in this one. But in the next one, I promise to do better. All right. Catch you next time, people.